I'm Lieutenant Commander Amelia Richmond, 38, and I worked my way up from a small-town kid with no connections to leading sailors on missions that never make the news but shape national security. For years, I showed up for my family covering their bills, bailing them out, rearranging deployments to be at every milestone, never asking for anything in return. But when my own father looked across a crowded rehearsal dinner and called me just Navy trash, I decided something had to change. Have you ever been humiliated by someone you've given everything to? If you have, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened at that wedding? No one saw coming. Then the toasts began, and everything changed. Jacob's father stood first, delivering the traditional speech about gaining a daughter and watching his son find happiness. Sweet, conventional, exactly what everyone expected. Then Amanda's maid of honor shared embarrassing college stories that made everyone laugh, and Amanda blushed prettily. I assumed that would be it. The formal toasts completed, the evening moving on to dancing and cake cutting. But then Jacob stood up unexpectedly, his champagne glass catching the light from the chandeliers. The room quieted expectantly, guests turning their attention to the new groom who apparently had something more to say. I know we've already heard some wonderful toasts tonight, Jacob began, his voice carrying easily through the reception hall. But there's something I need to say, something I should have said last night. My stomach tightened. Amanda looked confused, glancing between Jacob and the wedding planner as if wondering whether this was part of the scheduled program. Dad shifted in his seat, probably hoping this wouldn't drag on too long and interfere with the bar service. Jacob's eyes found mine across the room. That moment of recognition I'd noticed during the ceremony suddenly made sense. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly who I was, what my rank meant, what those ribbons on my chest represented. Last night at the rehearsal dinner, someone made a comment that's been bothering me ever since, Jacob continued, his voice gaining strength. A comment about one of the most important people in my life, someone who deserves better than what she heard. The room went completely still. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Amanda's face went pale, her hands gripping her champagne flute so tightly I thought it might shatter. Mom's mouth fell open slightly, and Dad's expression shifted from confusion to dawning alarm. Jacob raised his glass higher, turning to face my table directly. I want everyone here to know something about Lieutenant Commander Amelia Richmond, Amanda's sister and my commanding officer for the past 2 years. The words hit like a thunderclap. Commanding officer. Every head in the room turned toward me, conversation stopping mid-sentence, forks freezing halfway to mouths. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications sank in. Jacob worked for me. Not just in the same Navy, not just in the same command structure, but directly under my authority. The civilian job his parents had mentioned, the work that required travel to Japan, it was all cover for his real position as a naval intelligence officer assigned to my unit. That woman who was called Navy trash last night, Jacob continued, his voice ringing with conviction, is one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege to serve under. She's led missions that I can't discuss in detail, but I can tell you they've directly contributed to our national security. She's earned the respect of every sailor in our command through her leadership, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to the men and women under her command. Dad's champagne glass slipped from his fingers. The sound of crystal shattering against the marble floor seemed to echo in the absolute silence of the reception hall. 200 guests stared as champagne spread across the white tablecloth, dripping onto his formal shoes. So when someone calls her trash, Jacob said, his voice never wavering, they're not just insulting a family member. They're insulting an officer who's dedicated her life to protecting the freedoms we all enjoy, including the freedom to speak carelessly about things we don't understand. Amanda was crying now, but whether from embarrassment, pride, or horror at having her wedding turned into a public confrontation, I couldn't tell. Mom reached for Dad's arm, but he was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before: shock, recognition, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Jacob turned back to the room, raising his glass higher. So I'd like to propose a toast to Lieutenant Commander Richmond, an exceptional officer and an even better person. Amanda is lucky to have her as a sister, and I'm honored to have her as both my commanding officer and my new family. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, people began to stand. Jacob's father first, then his mother, then the elderly man who'd nodded at my ribbons earlier. One by one, 200 wedding guests rose to their feet, glasses raised, eyes turned toward me. To Lieutenant Commander Richmond, Jacob said clearly. To Lieutenant Commander Richmond, the room echoed, voices ranging from confident to uncertain, but all participating in what had become an impromptu military toast at a civilian wedding. I stood automatically, the way I'd been trained to respond when being honored, but my legs felt unsteady. Every eye in the room was on me, every guest now aware of the family drama they'd accidentally witnessed, the casual cruelty that had been exposed by truth. Dad remained seated, staring at the broken glass at his feet as if it contained answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. His face had gone gray, aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The man who'd spent months trying to impress Jacob's family had just learned that his future son-in-law was not only military, the career he'd spent years mocking, but was actually subordinate to the daughter he'd publicly humiliated less than 24 hours earlier. The toast ended, guests gradually returning to their seats, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, with frequent glances in my direction. I caught fragments of whispers, commanding officer, national security, how embarrassing for her father. Jacob sat down next to Amanda, who was still crying silently into her napkin. He took her hand, whispered something in her ear that made her nod and squeeze his fingers. Whatever he'd said to her, it seemed to be reassurance rather than apology. He'd made a choice to defend his commanding officer, and he wasn't backing down from it, even at his own wedding. I remained standing for a moment longer, gathering my composure. The young woman who'd joined the Navy to prove herself worthy of respect had just received it from a room full of strangers, while the man whose approval she'd craved her entire life sat in stunned silence, surrounded by broken glass and spilled champagne. When I finally sat down, my table mates looked at me with expressions ranging from awe to sympathy. The college friend next to me leaned over and whispered, "I had no idea." That must have been incredibly difficult. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. Across the room, Dad was still staring at his hands, while Mom tried frantically to clean up the champagne with cocktail napkins. They looked small suddenly, diminished by the revelation that their pretend soldier daughter was actually responsible for the safety and success of officers like their new son-in-law. The rest of the reception continued, but the atmosphere remained charged. People were more careful around me now, more respectful, but also more distant. I'd become the officer at the wedding, the military authority figure, rather than simply Amanda's sister. It wasn't entirely comfortable, but it was honest in a way our family relationships had never been. When the evening finally ended, guests began drifting toward the exits with promises to stay in touch and thanks for a beautiful wedding. Dad hadn't spoken to me since Jacob's toast, hadn't even looked in my direction. He and Mom left early, citing exhaustion, but I saw him glance at me one final time before they disappeared into the parking garage. Amanda found me as I was gathering my things. Her makeup had been repaired, but her eyes were still red-rimmed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "About last night, about Dad, about everything. It's not your fault. I should have said something. Should have defended you." I looked at my sister, beautiful in her wedding dress, finally seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "Jacob did that for both of us." She nodded, tears threatening again. "I married a good man." "Yes, you did. And he's a hell of an officer too." For the first time all weekend, Amanda really laughed, not the careful social laughter that had characterized most of our interactions. I guess I should have paid more attention when he talked about work. As I drove back to my hotel, I thought about justice and vindication and the strange ways the universe sometimes delivers both. I'd spent 15 years trying to earn Dad's respect through patience and persistence, and showing up no matter how badly he treated me. In the end, respect had come not because I demanded it, but because someone else had recognized it was already there and had refused to let it be diminished. Jacob's toast hadn't been about defending me, it had been about stating facts. The same facts that had been true yesterday and last week and for years before that. Dad's problem wasn't that he didn't know who I was, it was that he'd never bothered to find out. The weeks following Amanda's wedding passed in a strange silence. No angry phone calls, no family dinners where Dad's comments would force awkward conversations, no attempts at reconciliation or explanation. It was as if the entire family had agreed to pretend the reception had never happened, that Jacob's toast was just a bad dream we'd all shared. Amanda called once, ostensibly to thank me for being in the wedding, but really to test the waters about family dynamics going forward. Her voice was careful, diplomatic, like she was conducting delicate international negotiations rather than talking to her sister. "How are things with Dad?" she asked, and I could hear Jacob coaching her in the background, probably reminding her that I was still his commanding officer regardless of family relationships. "There are no things with Dad," I told her honestly. "He hasn't called, I haven't called him. I assume he needs time to process what happened." What I didn't tell her was that I was also processing, working through 15 years of accumulated hurt and disappointment, trying to figure out what kind of relationship was possible with someone who'd needed his son-in-law to explain who his own daughter was. Mom called more frequently, but our conversations had a strange quality, like she was talking to someone she'd never met before. She asked about my work with new interest, questions that went beyond, "How's the Navy treating you?" to actual curiosity about what I did, where I'd been deployed, what my responsibilities included. "I never realized," she said during one conversation, "that you were in charge of so many people." It occurred to me that in 15 years of service, I'd never really explained my job to my parents. I'd tried early on, but their disinterest had been so clear that I'd stopped offering details. They'd never asked follow-up questions, never wanted to hear about deployments or promotions or the daily reality of military leadership. In their minds, I worked for the government, and that was sufficient detail. Now Mom wanted to know everything. How many people reported to me, what kind of decisions I made, whether my job was dangerous, whether I liked being in charge. Questions she should have asked years ago, but better late than never, I supposed. "I'm proud of you," she said at the end of one conversation, words I'd waited my entire adult life to hear. "I know I should have said it before, but I'm proud of what you've accomplished." It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt hollow, like praise offered too late to mean what it would have meant earlier. I appreciated the sentiment, but I'd moved beyond needing their approval. Jacob's toast had shown me the difference between earned respect and family obligation, and I'd realized I preferred the former. 3 weeks after the wedding, Dad finally called. Not to apologize exactly, but to awkwardly ask about my situation in the Navy. He avoided mentioning Jacob or the reception, but he wanted to know about my rank, my responsibilities, how much longer I planned to serve. "Jacob seems like a good kid," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "He's an excellent officer," I replied, emphasizing the professional relationship over the personal one. "Amanda's lucky to have married someone with his integrity." There was a long pause, and I could hear him processing the implications. Integrity. The word hung between us like an accusation, highlighting everything that had been missing from our relationship. "I guess I never understood what you actually did over there," he said finally. "You never asked." Another pause, longer this time. "Maybe you could explain it sometime, if you want to." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest Dad had ever come to admitting he'd been wrong about something important. I told him I'd think about it, which was true. I needed to decide whether I had the emotional energy to rebuild a relationship with someone who'd needed a stranger to tell him his daughter was worth respecting. Work became my refuge in a way it had always been, but more intentionally now. I threw myself into my duties with renewed focus, finding satisfaction in the clear hierarchies and explicit expectations of military life. When Jacob returned from his honeymoon, he treated me with the same professional respect he'd always shown, no acknowledgement of the family drama beyond a simple, Thank you for being there for Amanda. I appreciated his discretion. Our working relationship was too important to complicate with family dynamics, and he seemed to understand that instinctively. He was a good officer, which made him a good husband for my sister, but those were separate considerations in my mind. My perspective on family relationships shifted during those weeks. I'd spent years believing that love meant accepting whatever treatment people offered, that loyalty meant showing up regardless of how you were treated in return. But Jacob's toast had demonstrated something different, that real love sometimes meant refusing to accept disrespect, even from family. I started setting boundaries I'd never established before. When Mom suggested I come home for Dad's birthday, I declined politely but firmly. When she pressed, explaining that he was trying to understand, I told her that understanding should have come before public humiliation, not after. "He's your father," she said, the familiar refrain that had excused years of casual cruelty. "And I'm his daughter," I replied. That should have meant something before Jacob had to explain it to him. She didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one. Dad's relationship with me had been broken long before the wedding, built on assumptions and prejudices rather than genuine interest in who I'd become. The reception had just made that brokenness visible to everyone else. I wasn't angry anymore, which surprised me. Anger required energy I didn't want to spend on people who'd proven they didn't value what I had to offer. Instead, I felt something closer to indifference, the emotional equivalent of cutting loose dead weight. My life was full without their approval. I had colleagues who respected my judgment, sailors who trusted my leadership, friends who valued my company. I had Amanda, who seemed to finally see me clearly, and Jacob, who'd proven himself capable of standing up for what was right even when it was uncomfortable. Most importantly, I had myself 15 years of earned confidence, professional accomplishment, and the knowledge that I'd built something meaningful with my life. That was more than enough foundation for whatever came next. 6 months later, Dad asked to meet for lunch. Not through Mom, not through Amanda, but a direct call to me with a simple request. "I'd like to take you to lunch, if you're free," he said, his voice lacking the casual confidence that had always characterized our conversations. I was skeptical but curious. In the months since the wedding, he'd made a few more attempts at conversation, asking questions about my work that suggested he'd been doing research. Not deep research, but enough to understand that lieutenant commanders weren't entry-level positions, that my responsibilities involved more than he'd ever imagined. We met at a diner halfway between his house and the base, neutral territory that felt appropriate for what might be a difficult conversation. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 coffee cups and a nervous expression I'd never seen on his face before. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat down, and something in his tone told me this wasn't going to be the surface-level interaction I'd expected. We ordered food neither of us seemed particularly interested in eating, making small talk about the weather and Amanda's adjustment to married life. Dad looked older than I remembered, gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at the wedding. Whether from age or stress, I couldn't tell. "I've been thinking about what happened at the reception," he said finally, cutting straight to the point in a way that was more characteristic of military communication than his usual approach to difficult topics. Okay, I was wrong. Not just wrong about what I said, but wrong about everything. About your career, about what you do, about who you are. He stared at his coffee cup, hands wrapped around it like it was keeping him warm. I spent 15 years being proud of the wrong things and dismissing the things I should have been celebrating. It wasn't the apology I'd imagined, because it was more honest than anything I'd expected from him. No excuses about generational differences or misunderstandings. Just a straightforward admission that he'd failed to see his own daughter clearly. "I called your commanding officer last week," he continued, and my stomach dropped. "Admiral Morrison. I told him I was your father and that I wanted to understand what you actually do for the Navy." I felt my face flush with embarrassment. "Dad, you can't just," he told me about the mission you led in the Persian Gulf last year. The one that prevented a potential international incident. He said you made decisions under pressure that probably saved lives, that you showed exactly the kind of leadership the Navy needs from its officers. I stared at him, not knowing how to respond. Dad had never shown interest in the details of my deployments, had never wanted to hear about the responsibilities that kept me awake at night or the successes that made the job worthwhile. He also told me that you'd been selected for promotion to full commander, that you're being considered for executive officer positions on major vessels. That officers with your record usually make captain if they want it. Dad finally looked up from his coffee, meeting my eyes for the first time since I'd sat down. I didn't know any of that. I should have known all of it. The promotion news was supposed to be confidential until the official announcement, but I wasn't surprised Admiral Morrison had shared it. He was old-school Navy, believed that families should understand and support their service members. If my father had called asking questions, the Admiral would have made sure he got complete answers. 26 years, Dad continued. 26 years of you achieving things I couldn't even comprehend, and I dismissed it all because it didn't fit what I thought success looked like. Because I was too proud and too stupid to ask the right questions. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box, placing it on the table between us. I bought this for you when you made lieutenant. Never gave it to you because I didn't think it meant anything. Now I know it meant everything, and I was just too ignorant to see it. Inside the box was a simple gold chain with a small anchor pendant. Nothing elaborate, but clearly chosen with care, probably the only piece of military-themed jewelry he'd ever purchased. I know I can't undo 15 years of being a terrible father, he said quietly. Can't take back the things I said or make up for the support I should have given you. But I want you to know that I see you now. I see who you are and what you've accomplished, and I'm more proud of you than I've ever been of anything in my life. I picked up the necklace, feeling the weight of it, understanding that it represented more than jewelry. It was his acknowledgement that I'd been right to pursue the career he'd spent years mocking, that my achievements were real and valuable and worthy of respect. I don't need you to forgive me, he continued. Don't deserve it, honestly. But I need you to know that when people ask about my daughters, I tell them about Amanda's wedding and Jacob's career, and then I tell them about my older daughter, the Navy commander who's one of the finest officers in the service. I tell them I'm proud of you, even though I know I don't have the right to be. We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing emotions that felt too big for the small diner. Dad's apology wasn't going to erase years of dismissal and disrespect, but it was honest in a way that felt like a foundation for something different. I can't promise to understand everything about your job, he said finally. But I can promise to ask questions instead of making assumptions. To listen instead of judging. To be the father you deserve to have from the beginning. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, but something closer to possibility. The chance that we might build a relationship based on who we actually were rather than who we'd failed to be for each other. I'd like that, I said, fastening the necklace around my neck. I'd like that very much. The anchor settled against my chest, a small weight that felt like hope. 2 years later, I stood on the bridge of the USS Hampton as its executive officer, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic during what would be my final deployment before taking command of my own vessel. The promotion to full commander had come through exactly as Admiral Morrison had predicted, and with it, the opportunity I'd worked toward my entire career. Dad called every Sunday now, regular as clockwork, wanting updates on where we were heading, what the mission involved, how the crew was performing. Our conversations had evolved from his awkward questions about my situation to genuine interest in naval operations, ship management, and the daily challenges of leading 300 sailors across multiple time zones. He'd started reading military history, trying to understand the context of modern naval operations. When I mentioned dealing with tensions in the South China Sea, he'd ask informed questions about previous conflicts in the region. When I described the complexity of coordinating with allied fleets, he wanted to know how those relationships had developed historically. Most surprisingly, he'd become my unofficial public relations officer back home. When neighbors asked about his daughters, he'd still mention Amanda's successful marriage and growing business, but now he spent equal time talking about my command selection, my deployment schedule, and his plans to attend my change of command ceremony when I took over the USS Fitzgerald in 6 months. My daughter's going to be a ship captain, he'd tell anyone who'd listen, and according to Mom, he carried photos of me in uniform right next to the pictures of Amanda's wedding. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of careful conversations, of him asking questions and me learning to trust that his interest was genuine rather than performative. There had been setbacks, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, when he'd slip back into dismissive comments that revealed how deeply his prejudices had been ingrained. But he'd caught himself each time, apologized without being asked, and recommitted to seeing me clearly. It was the kind of consistent effort that meant more than any single gesture could have, proof that he understood this wasn't about one conversation or one apology, but about rebuilding an entire relationship from scratch. Amanda had watched our reconciliation with a mixture of relief and amazement. At family gatherings, she'd observed Dad asking detailed questions about my career with the same intensity he'd once reserved for Jacob's civilian job prospects. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that my brother-in-law still served under my command, creating family dynamics that would have been impossible to navigate 2 years earlier. Jacob had handled the situation with characteristic professionalism, maintaining appropriate boundaries between his military and family roles. At work, he was Lieutenant Richmond, following orders and contributing to missions with the same dedication he'd always shown. At family dinners, he was Amanda's husband, my brother-in-law, someone who could finally bridge the gap between Dad's understanding and my reality. It's strange, Amanda had told me during one of our now regular phone conversations, seeing Dad actually proud of you instead of just claiming to be. Like he finally figured out what the rest of us always knew. But I wasn't sure that was entirely true. I think Amanda and Mom had always loved me, but they'd also never pushed back against Dad's dismissiveness, never challenged his assumptions about my career or demanded he treat me with respect. Love without advocacy had felt hollow in its own way, different from Dad's outright disrespect, but still painful. Now our family gatherings had a different energy. Dad would ask about my upcoming command, my plans for the ship, my goals for the crew. He'd listen to my answers with genuine attention, asking follow-up questions that showed he was processing what I told him rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. When I mentioned the challenges of being one of only a handful of women commanding naval vessels, he didn't dismiss the obstacles or suggest they weren't real. Instead, he asked what support systems were available, whether the Navy was doing enough to address gender disparities, what changes he might see in military leadership during his lifetime. These were conversations we should have been having for 15 years, but I'd learned not to dwell on lost time. What mattered was that we were having them now, building something new rather than trying to repair something that had been fundamentally broken. The night before we returned to port, I stood on deck watching the stars and thinking about justice, respect, and the strange ways both could arrive when you'd stopped expecting them. Jacob's toast at the wedding had forced a reckoning that I'd been avoiding, had made visible the dysfunction that our family had been accommodating for years. But the real change had come later, in Dad's willingness to confront his own failures, to admit he'd been wrong about something fundamental, and to put in the daily work of becoming a better father. That kind of transformation required more courage than I'd ever given him credit for. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dad. Saw the news about the Fitzgerald command ceremony. Mom and I will be there. Wouldn't miss it for anything. Proud of you, Commander. I smiled, touching the anchor necklace I'd worn every day for 2 years. The weight of it had become familiar, a reminder that respect wasn't something you inherited or demanded, but something you earned and gave and sometimes fought for. In 6 months, I'd take command of my own ship, responsible for the lives and careers of sailors who would trust my judgment in situations that might determine their futures. It was the opportunity I'd worked toward my entire career, the culmination of 15 years of proving myself worthy of that trust. And for the first time in my adult life, my father would be watching with pride rather than confusion, understanding exactly what that moment meant and why it mattered. The anchor necklace caught the starlight, a small symbol of the respect that had always been mine by right but had taken a wedding toast and 2 years of hard conversations to finally claim. I grew up believing that love meant showing up, no matter what. My father never said those words directly, but I learned early that if you cared about someone, you made sacrifices. You put their needs first. You proved your worth through action, not words. For 26 years, I lived by that code, even when it felt like I was the only one following it. Dad worked construction his entire life. 40 years of early mornings, calloused hands, and a paycheck that barely stretched to cover the bills. He took pride in that work, the kind of pride that comes from building something tangible, something you can point to and say, I made that. When I told him I was joining the Navy after college, his face went flat. Not disappointed exactly, but confused, like I'd announced I was moving to Mars. Real work happens on land, he said, not looking up from his newspaper. Government jobs are for people who can't cut it in the real world. I tried explaining that the Navy wasn't just a job, that it was service, that it meant something. He nodded along, but I could see in his eyes that he'd already filed my decision under things my daughter does that I don't understand. The list was apparently getting longer. Still, I showed up. When Mom needed surgery and they couldn't cover the copay, I sent money. When Dad's truck broke down and he was too proud to ask for help, I quietly paid for the repairs. When my sister graduated high school, I took leave to be there, even though I was in the middle of officer training. Every family barbecue, every birthday, every holiday I could manage, I was there. The Navy taught me discipline, leadership, responsibility. I learned to make decisions that affected dozens of people's lives. I managed budgets larger than most small businesses. I earned the respect of sailors who'd been serving since before I was born. But when I came home in uniform, Dad would look at me like I was playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. How's the boat business? He'd ask, and I'd correct him ships, not boats, and he'd wave me off like the distinction was meaningless. When I made lieutenant, he congratulated me the same way he'd congratulate a child for winning a participation trophy. Polite but empty. Mom tried to bridge the gap sometimes. She'd ask about my deployments, where I'd been, what I'd seen. But even her questions felt careful, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. They both treated my career like an extended phase I was going through, something I'd eventually grow out of and come home to do real work. The irony was that my Navy salary was often what kept their household running. When Dad's hours got cut during the recession, I covered their mortgage for 6 months. When Mom's car died, I helped with the down payment on a replacement. I never made a big deal about it, never asked for recognition. I just did what family was supposed to do, what I'd been taught to do. My sister Amanda was different. Younger by 4 years, she'd always been Dad's favorite, though he'd never admit it. She was studying business, planning to marry her college boyfriend Jacob, and talking about settling down close to home. Everything Dad understood, everything that made sense to him. When she announced her engagement, he cried actual tears of joy. When I'd been promoted to department head, he'd asked if it came with a raise. I learned to swallow the disappointment. I told myself that family relationships were complicated, that Dad showed love in his own way, that actions mattered more than words. I believed that if I just kept showing up, kept proving my loyalty, kept being the daughter who never let them down, eventually he'd see me. Really see me. The wedding planning consumed the better part of a year. Amanda threw herself into every detail with the intensity of someone planning a moon landing. Jacob's family had money, not wealthy exactly, but comfortable in a way that made my parents suddenly conscious of our old furniture and Dad's 20-year-old truck. They started talking differently, using words like elegant and sophisticated that sounded foreign in Dad's voice. I offered to help with costs. Amanda's dress alone cost more than I'd spent on my car. But when I suggested contributing to the reception or the flowers, Dad waved me off. We've got it covered, he said, but I saw the credit card statements on their kitchen counter, saw the stress lines deepening around Mom's eyes. Pride was more important than practicality. Always had been. The engagement party was at Jacob's parents' house, a colonial in the suburbs with a 3-car garage and landscaping that looked professionally maintained. I wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, but I felt underdressed the moment I walked in. Jacob's father was a marketing executive. His mother worked in real estate. They asked polite questions about my career, nodding along when I explained naval operations, but I could see their eyes glaze over. Dad spent most of the evening talking to Jacob's father about sports and the economy. I watched him laugh at jokes that weren't particularly funny, agree with opinions that contradicted things he'd said at home. He was trying so hard to fit in, to prove he belonged in this world of white wine and cloth napkins. It was painful to watch. When Jacob's mother asked what I did, Dad answered before I could speak. "She's in the Navy," he said, the same tone he might use to say she's between jobs. No mention of my rank, my responsibilities, the fact that I'd just been selected for a special assignment that most officers would kill for. Just she's in the Navy, like it was something that happened to me rather than something I'd earned. I smiled and changed the subject. I'd learned that fighting these battles in public never ended well. But something shifted that night, watching Dad perform for strangers while treating my achievements like embarrassments. I started to realize that showing up wasn't enough. That love without respect was just obligation dressed up in family loyalty. And that maybe, after 26 years, it was time to stop accepting less than I deserved. The comments started getting sharper about 3 months before the wedding. Little digs disguised as jokes, observations that weren't quite criticisms but felt like paper cuts. Dad had never been one for subtlety, but now his disapproval came wrapped in humor that made it harder to confront directly. "Here comes Admiral Amelia," he'd say when I walked into family gatherings, and everyone would chuckle like it was affectionate teasing instead of mockery. When relatives asked about my career, he'd interrupt with stories about real sailors from World War II, men who'd seen actual combat, not like today's military, which was mostly paperwork and political correctness. I tried to let it roll off me. Dad had always been uncomfortable with change, with things he didn't understand. But these weren't random comments anymore. They were targeted, deliberate, designed to diminish. When my cousin asked about my deployment to the Mediterranean, Dad cut in before I could answer. "Oh, that was basically a cruise," he said, waving his beer bottle dismissively. "Navy these days is like a floating hotel. Nothing like the old days when sailors were actually tough." I'd served in waters where Iranian patrol boats tested our resolve daily. I'd made decisions that could have started international incidents. I'd worked 18-hour days in conditions that would break most civilian jobs. But explaining that would sound like bragging, and Dad had a talent for making legitimate pride seem like arrogance. Amanda noticed the tension but chose to ignore it. Wedding stress was consuming all her emotional energy, and Dad's behavior toward me was just one more complication she didn't want to deal with. When I mentioned feeling excluded from family conversations, she sighed like I was being dramatic. "You know how Dad is," she said, not looking up from her seating chart. "He doesn't mean anything by it. He's just set in his ways." But it wasn't just Dad anymore. Amanda had started laughing along with his comments, rolling her eyes when I talked about Navy regulations or protocol. She'd begun introducing me to her new in-laws as my sister who thinks she's in the military, like my 15-year career was an elaborate game of pretend. The dynamic became clear at the engagement party follow-up dinner. Jacob's family had invited us to their country club, and Mom spent a week agonizing over what to wear. Dad borrowed a tie from our neighbor and complained the entire drive about putting on airs for people who probably can't change their own oil. The country club dining room was all dark wood and oil paintings of dead rich men. I felt out of place immediately, not because of the setting, but because of how my own family was treating me in it. When the conversation turned to careers, Jacob's father asked about my work with genuine curiosity. Before I could respond, Dad jumped in. "Amelia likes to play soldier," he said, and got a few uncomfortable laughs. "Keeps her busy, I guess. Better than sitting around the house. Play soldier." 15 years of service, multiple commendations, leadership positions that required security clearances most civilians couldn't qualify for, and I was playing soldier. I felt my face burn, but I kept my expression neutral. Getting defensive would only prove his point. Jacob's mother tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but the damage was done. For the rest of the evening, I was the family member with the pretend job, the one who'd chosen to waste her education on military cosplay instead of contributing something meaningful to society. Amanda said nothing. Worse than nothing, she nodded along when Dad talked about my phase and how I'd eventually settle down and find real direction. Her silence felt like betrayal, but I understood the pressure she was under. This wedding was her moment, her chance to marry into a family that represented everything our family aspired to be. My bruised feelings were a small price to pay for her happiness. On the drive home, Mom tried to smooth things over. "You know your father's proud of you," she said quietly. "He just doesn't know how to show it." But I was done making excuses for him. Pride wasn't something you had to decode like a secret message. Respect wasn't a feeling you kept hidden out of embarrassment. If Dad was proud of me, he had funny ways of showing it. And if he couldn't figure out how to support his daughter's career after 15 years, maybe the problem wasn't communication. The worst part was how normal it had all become. Dad's dismissiveness, Amanda's complicity, Mom's endless excuses. They'd created a family dynamic where my achievements were treated as inconveniences, where my success made everyone else uncomfortable because it didn't fit their narrative of who I was supposed to be. I started skipping some family dinners. When Dad asked where I'd been, I told him I was busy with work, which prompted another round of jokes about busy work and government efficiency. The irony was that my absence proved his point. In his mind, military people were unreliable, too important for their own families, too caught up in their own self-importance to prioritize what really mattered. 2 weeks before the wedding, Jacob's family threw a casual barbecue to introduce the extended families. I arrived in civilian clothes, hoping to blend in, to avoid giving Dad any ammunition. But he found ways to work my career into conversations anyway, always with that dismissive edge that made my service sound like an elaborate hobby. When Jacob's uncle mentioned his son was considering military academy, Dad practically snorted. "Different world these days," he said. "Kids think it's like summer camp with uniforms. Not like the real military our fathers knew." I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to understand how I'd become the family embarrassment. How serving my country with honor had somehow made me the person everyone needed to apologize for or explain away. That night, I made a decision. I was done shrinking to make other people comfortable. Done apologizing for choices I was proud of. Done pretending that Dad's disrespect was just miscommunication or generational differences. If my family couldn't accept who I was, that said more about them than it did about me. The rehearsal dinner was held at the same country club where Dad had first called me a pretend soldier. Ironic, maybe, but Amanda loved the venue, and Jacob's parents were paying, so country club it was. The room buzzed with pre-wedding excitement, champagne flowing freely, everyone dressed in their finest clothes and brightest smiles. I'd spent an hour getting ready, choosing a navy blue dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing. The goal was to blend in, to be present for Amanda without giving Dad any reason to make me the center of negative attention. I wanted this to be her night, uncomplicated by family drama or uncomfortable confrontations. The seating arrangement should have been my first clue. I was placed at the far end of the long head table, between Jacob's elderly great-aunt and a family friend I'd met once. Amanda was in the center, flanked by Jacob and both sets of parents, radiating happiness in her champagne-colored dress. Dad sat 3 seats from the bride, close enough to be in all the photos, far enough from me to avoid accidental conversation. The dinner conversation flowed around topics I had little connection to: wedding plans, honeymoon destinations, Jacob's new job at his father's company. I listened politely, asked appropriate questions, played the role of supportive sister without trying to insert myself into narratives that didn't include me. It was a skill I'd perfected over the years, being present without being intrusive, supportive without being needy. Halfway through the main course, Jacob's cousin David arrived late from his flight. He was around my age, worked in finance, and had that easy confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. As he settled into the empty chair across from me, someone mentioned that he'd just gotten back from a business trip to Japan. "What kind of work takes you overseas?" I asked, making conversation. David launched into a detailed explanation of international markets and currency exchange. Impressive stuff, clearly lucrative, the kind of career that fit perfectly into this crowd's definition of success. When he finished, he turned the question back to me. "What about you, Amelia? What do you do?" Before I could open my mouth, Dad's voice cut across the table from 3 seats away. He'd been listening to our conversation, waiting for exactly this moment. "Don't bother," he said, loud enough for half the table to hear. "She's just Navy trash." The words hit like a physical blow. Not criticism this time, not dismissive humor or backhanded comments disguised as affection. Just a flat, brutal dismissal delivered with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. Navy trash. The table went silent. Not the comfortable quiet of people pausing their conversations, but the awful, thick silence that follows when someone says something so inappropriate that no one knows how to respond. Forks stopped moving. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the background chatter from other tables seemed to fade. I felt my face flush hot, then cold. 15 years of service, multiple deployments, countless 18-hour days, decisions that affected dozens of people's lives, all of it reduced to 2 words delivered by the man who was supposed to love me unconditionally. Amanda's eyes went wide, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her mouth. Mom looked horrified, but in the way that suggested she was more concerned about the social awkwardness than the cruelty of the comment. Jacob's family exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable but not sure whether to intervene in what was obviously family dysfunction. David looked confused, glancing between Dad and me like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of inside joke he didn't understand. The great-aunt beside me cleared her throat and took a large gulp of wine. After what felt like an hour but was probably 10 seconds, someone forced out an awkward laugh. Then another. Not real laughter, but the kind of nervous social noise people make when they don't know how else to fill an unbearable silence. The sound of people pretending they hadn't heard what they'd clearly heard, hadn't witnessed what was impossible to ignore. I could have defended myself. Could have listed my accomplishments, my rank, my security clearance. Could have explained what it meant to be entrusted with million-dollar equipment and the lives of the sailors under my command. Could have described the respect I'd earned from colleagues who judged me on performance, not on their preconceived notions about what careers were worthy of respect. Instead, I smiled. Not a real smile, but the polite, controlled expression I'd learned in countless professional situations where showing emotion would be seen as weakness. I picked up my water glass and took a careful sip, buying myself time to process what had just happened. Navy trash. In front of people he'd been trying to impress for months. In front of Amanda's new family, who would now always remember me as the family embarrassment, the sister whose own father was ashamed of her career choice. In front of my sister, on the night before her wedding, when all I'd wanted was to celebrate her happiness without creating drama. The conversation gradually resumed, people working hard to pretend the moment hadn't happened. But I felt every sideways glance, every careful avoidance of eye contact. I'd become the thing everyone was politely ignoring, the family dysfunction that would be whispered about in cars on the drive home. Amanda reached for Jacob's hand, her knuckles white. She caught my eye for a moment, her expression unreadable, then looked away quickly. Not anger at Dad for his cruelty, not sympathy for me. Just the look of someone who wanted this awkwardness to disappear so her perfect evening could continue uninterrupted. For the rest of the dinner, I spoke only when spoken to directly. I complimented the meal, asked polite questions about honeymoon plans, laughed at appropriate moments. I played the role of gracious family member while something fundamental shifted inside me. Navy trash. The phrase echoed in my head like a song stuck on repeat. Not, I wish you'd chosen differently, or I don't understand your career. Not even, I think you could do better. Just trash. Something worthless, disposable, embarrassing. When the evening finally ended, people scattered to cars and hotel rooms with promises to see each other at the ceremony tomorrow. Dad avoided looking at me directly, already moving on to post-dinner drinks with Jacob's father. Mom squeezed my shoulder and whispered that he'd had too much champagne, as if alcohol was an excuse for cruelty rather than just a revealer of it. I drove back to my hotel room alone, Dad's words following me like smoke. Navy trash. In 12 hours, I'd put on my dress uniform and walk my sister down the aisle, and everyone in that church would remember this moment. Would see me as the family member even her own father couldn't respect. Back in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing my navy dress, Dad's words playing on repeat. Navy trash. 2 words that somehow managed to erase 15 years of service, multiple deployments, and a career I'd built through discipline and dedication. 2 words that reduced everything I'd worked for to something disposable, embarrassing. I stared at my uniform hanging in the closet. Full dress blues, pristine and pressed, with ribbons that told the story of my service. Each one earned through months of training, dangerous deployments, leadership positions that required split-second decisions affecting dozens of lives. The uniform I'd planned to wear tomorrow as a gesture of respect for my sister's wedding, a way to honor the occasion with my finest attire. Now it felt like a costume. That's what Dad saw when he looked at me, someone playing dress-up, pretending to be important. The fact that I'd actually earned the right to wear it, that it represented real achievement and real responsibility, was irrelevant to him. In his world, I was still the little girl who'd disappointed him by choosing the wrong career, except now I was old enough that disappointment had curdled into contempt. I called my mentor, Captain Martinez, without really planning to. She'd been my commanding officer during my first deployment, a woman who'd risen through the ranks when it was even harder for women to succeed in the Navy. If anyone would understand what I was feeling, it would be her. Amelia. Her voice was warm despite the late hour. "How's the family wedding going?" I told her about the rehearsal dinner, about Dad's comment, about feeling like an outsider in my own family. My voice stayed steady, professional, but she could hear the hurt underneath. "You know what your problem is?" she said when I finished. "You're still trying to earn respect from someone who's already decided you don't deserve it. You've spent 15 years proving yourself to everyone except the one person whose approval you thought mattered most. I just wanted him to be proud of me." "Amelia, listen to me. You command the respect of sailors who've been in the Navy longer than you've been alive. You've been entrusted with equipment worth millions of dollars and missions that could affect international relations. You've earned every ounce of respect you give to others, and you've earned the right to expect it in return." After we hung up, I sat in the dark hotel room thinking about respect. Not the kind you demanded or the kind you inherited, but the kind you earned through action, through integrity, through proving yourself worthy of trust. I'd spent my entire adult life earning that kind of respect from colleagues, subordinates, superiors. People who judged me based on performance, not prejudice. But I'd never expected it from my own family. I'd accepted crumbs and called them love, tolerated disrespect and called it family loyalty. I'd made excuses for Dad's behavior because blood was supposed to be thicker than water, because family was supposed to love you unconditionally. The truth was harder to admit. Love without respect wasn't love at all. It was obligation dressed up in familial expectations. And I'd been an accomplice in my own diminishment, showing up faithfully for people who saw my presence as a burden rather than a gift. I thought about tomorrow's ceremony, about walking down the aisle in my dress uniform while everyone remembered tonight's humiliation. About Dad avoiding eye contact while he walked Amanda to the altar, about Jacob's family whispering about the sister whose own father couldn't tolerate her career choice. Then I thought about something else. About integrity, about self-respect, about the difference between taking the high road and letting people walk all over you. About the possibility that sometimes standing up for yourself was more important than keeping the peace. I'd spent my career learning that respect wasn't given freely, it was earned, commanded, sometimes fought for. In the Navy, if someone disrespected you, you addressed it directly and professionally. You didn't make excuses for them or pretend it hadn't happened. You held them accountable for their behavior and demanded better. Maybe it was time to apply those same principles to my family relationships. Maybe showing up wasn't enough anymore. Maybe love really did require mutual respect, and maybe I'd been accepting a counterfeit version for too long. I thought about the uniform hanging in my closet. Not a costume, not dress up, not something to be ashamed of. A symbol of service, of sacrifice, of dedication to something larger than myself. A representation of values I'd sworn to uphold: honor, courage, commitment. Tomorrow was Amanda's day, and I wouldn't do anything to ruin it. But I also wouldn't apologize for who I was or minimize my achievements to make other people comfortable. I'd wear my uniform with pride, stand tall, and let my service speak for itself. If Dad had a problem with that, he could keep it to himself. I was done shrinking to accommodate his discomfort. Done pretending his disrespect was anything other than his own failure to recognize value when it didn't match his expectations. The young woman who'd joined the Navy 15 years ago had been desperate for his approval, willing to accept any scraps of affection he offered. But that woman had grown into someone who commanded ships and led sailors and made decisions that mattered. She'd learned the difference between respect and approval, between love and tolerance. And she was done accepting less than she deserved, even from family. Especially from family. I hung up my Navy dress and laid out my uniform for tomorrow. Every ribbon perfectly placed, every button polished, every detail representing years of earned respect. Whatever happened at the wedding, I'd face it with the dignity and honor my service had taught me. Navy trash. The words still stung, but they no longer felt like truth. They felt like one man's limitation, his inability to see beyond his own narrow definitions of worth and success. That was his problem, not mine. Tomorrow, I'd let my uniform do the talking. The morning of Amanda's wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect September day that makes you believe the universe is conspiring to create happiness. I woke early, as I always did, and spent an hour in the hotel gym working out the tension from last night's humiliation. Physical exercise had always been my way of processing difficult emotions, turning anger and hurt into something useful, something that made me stronger rather than bitter. Back in my room, I laid out my dress uniform with the same precision I'd use for a formal inspection. Navy blue jacket with gold buttons, white trousers with the gold stripe down the side, white cap with its black visor. The ribbons told the story of my service: National Defense Service Medal, Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, Sea Service Deployment Ribbon. Each one represented months of work, challenges overcome, respect earned through performance rather than inheritance. As I dressed, I thought about the decision I'd made the night before. I wouldn't apologize for who I was anymore, wouldn't shrink to make other people comfortable. But I also wouldn't turn Amanda's wedding into a battlefield. This was her day, her moment of happiness, and whatever issues Dad and I needed to resolve could wait until after she'd said her vows. The ceremony was at St. Mary's, the same church where Mom and Dad had been married 32 years ago. I arrived early, before most of the guests, and found Amanda in the bridal suite looking radiant and nervous in equal measure. Her dress was everything she'd dreamed of: vintage lace with pearl buttons, a train that would photograph beautifully in the church's long aisle. "You look beautiful," I told her, and meant it. Whatever complicated feelings existed between us, whatever resentments had built up over the years, she was still my sister. Still the little girl who'd followed me around the house, who'd asked me to read her bedtime stories, who'd cried when I left for boot camp. "Thanks," she said, but her eyes were on my uniform, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "I thought you were wearing the Navy dress." I decided on the uniform instead. "It's more formal, more appropriate for such an important occasion." She nodded, but I could see her calculating the potential for drama, wondering if my choice would create tension with Dad. The fact that she automatically worried about his reaction rather than simply accepting my decision told me everything I needed to know about the family dynamics we'd all learned to navigate. "Today is really important to me," she said quietly. "I know. That's why I'm wearing my best." The church filled quickly. Jacob's family clustered on the right side, our smaller contingent on the left. I took my seat in the second pew, behind Mom and Dad, close enough to be identified as immediate family, but far enough away to avoid forced conversation. Dad glanced back when I sat down, his eyes registering the uniform with a tightness around his mouth, but he didn't say anything. Other guests noticed too. I caught several glances, some curious, some appreciative. An elderly man I didn't recognize nodded respectfully when he saw my ribbons. A woman about Mom's age whispered something to her husband that looked like approval. For most people, a military dress uniform at a wedding was a sign of respect, a way of honoring the occasion with formal attire. But I could feel Dad's disapproval radiating from the pew in front of me like heat from a radiator. His shoulders were rigid, his posture screaming discomfort. In his mind, I was making a statement, drawing attention to myself, refusing to let this day be about anyone else. The fact that I was simply wearing appropriate formal attire to my sister's wedding was irrelevant. In his narrative, everything I did was somehow wrong. The ceremony began with traditional pageantry. Jacob's groomsmen filed in wearing matching gray suits, looking nervous and proud. Then the music swelled, and Amanda appeared at the back of the church on Dad's arm, glowing with happiness. Every head turned to watch her progress down the aisle, murmurs of appreciation following her train. I stood with everyone else, watching my sister marry a man who clearly adored her. Whatever else was true about this day, about our family, about the complicated web of relationships that had brought us to this moment, Amanda deserved this happiness. She deserved a wedding day untainted by family drama, a marriage that started with nothing but love and hope. Dad walked her to the altar with visible pride. This was his moment too, the traditional father's role that he understood completely. He kissed Amanda's cheek, shook Jacob's hand, and took his seat next to Mom with the satisfied expression of a man who'd fulfilled his duty perfectly. The ceremony was beautiful, traditional, everything Amanda had wanted. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be married, Dad stood and answered, "Her mother, and I do," in a voice that carried clearly through the church. When Jacob and Amanda exchanged vows, even the most cynical guests dabbed at their eyes. When they kissed as husband and wife, the applause was spontaneous and heartfelt. I clapped along with everyone else, genuinely happy for my sister despite everything else that had happened. This was what mattered: Amanda's joy, Jacob's devotion, the beginning of a new family that might handle love and respect better than the one we'd grown up in. But I also noticed Jacob's eyes when he spotted me during the recessional. A quick double take, a moment of recognition that he covered quickly but not before I saw it. Interesting. Most civilians couldn't read military ribbons, couldn't distinguish between different ranks or specialties. But Jacob's reaction suggested he knew exactly what my uniform meant. At the reception, I was seated at a table with some of Amanda's college friends and their husbands, people who knew me peripherally but weren't invested in family politics. The conversation was light, friendly, focused on the happiness of the occasion rather than old grievances or complicated relationships. I danced with my uncle, chatted with distant cousins, played the role of supportive sister without drawing unnecessary attention to myself. Several people complimented my uniform, thanked me for my service, asked respectful questions about military life. Normal interactions with people who saw a naval officer rather than a family disappointment. Dad kept his distance, but I caught him watching me sometimes, his expression unreadable. Mom tried to bridge the gap by bringing me updates on various relatives, but her cheerfulness felt forced, like she was working hard to pretend last night hadn't happened. As the evening progressed, I began to relax. Maybe this would be enough: showing up, supporting Amanda, wearing my uniform with quiet pride without creating drama. Maybe respect didn't have to be demanded or fought for. Maybe it was enough to simply refuse to accept disrespect, to carry myself with dignity regardless of how others chose to treat me. Then the toasts began, and everything changed. And that's how one toast turned years of disrespect into a moment I'll never forget. Have you ever had someone publicly stand up for you when you least expected it? Or had to face a family member who finally saw you for who you really are? Share your experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if this story resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for more true stories about standing your ground and owning your worth.